Continuing our discussion of describing matter, we're going to talk about the difference between intensive and extensive properties. So intensive properties do not depend on the amount of material present. Extensive properties do. This is a classification of types of properties that give us different types of usefulness or utility for those properties. So let's take a look a little more in depth. Intensive. We look, intensive is independent of amount. It does not matter how much stuff you have present. So examples include things like color. Okay, so, Coke is brown. If you have more Coca-Cola, it's still brown. It doesn't change that. Temperature, pressure, boiling point. A little bit of water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. A lot of water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Extensive properties do depend on how much you have present. Extensive, the name comes from extent. It's the same root word here. So extent is where the word extensive comes from. It depends on the extent of stuff you have present. So examples would be mass, volume, length, area. If we think about these, mass is how much matter is present. So of course, that's going to depend on how much is present. Volume, how much space it occupies. Well, how much stuff do you have is going to describe that. If you're dealing with the length of rope, more rope is longer. So length will increase in that regard. Mass and volume are the most common extensive properties we would work with in chemistry. The utility, these two different types of properties have different kinds of utilities. So intensive properties, a lot of them are characteristic of the type of matter. So not all of them, like temperature isn't, but the properties that we use to identify the type of matter to give it a name are all going to be intensive. So for example, this piece of metal right here is called copper. Name is an intensive property. More copper is still called copper. So it's a reddish brown. So that reddish brown color is intensive. So the fact that it's reddish brown is intensive. The fact that it's a metal is intensive. And the fact that it conducts electricity is intensive. If you had more or less copper, all of those properties would still have the exact same value. So intensive properties are needed to identify matter, to give it a name. Extensive properties then depend on the amount of material present. So these would be used to describe a particular sample. This piece of copper that we're looking at is 253 grams, and it has a mass of 28.2 milliliters. We'll define those units moving on if you're not familiar, but those are mass and volume, right? And so what that means is that gives us information about that piece of copper. That is not generically true for copper, right? Copper has, you can have all different sizes and shapes of copper, but that particular piece of copper has that mass and volume, and that's what makes that an extensive property. So if you're looking at describing a particular sample, those are always extensive properties that give you the amount of material present. And in order to define a particular sample, you need intensive properties. Now, there are some intensive properties like temperature that are not characteristic. They can change, but they still don't define the type, the amount of sample you have. So let's look at an example. Determine whether or not these properties are intensive or extensive. These are the same properties we looked at for chemical, physical. And really the question is it extensive? Does it depend on how much of the substance is present? So water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, well, water boils at 212 Fahrenheit, a little bit of water, a lot of bit of water. That's going to be intensive. Okay, so that's going to be an intensive property. Zinc metal is a bluish white metal. That's just the color. There's no indication of how much metal you have that is required to affect that color. That's going to be intensive too. When zinc is added to an acid solution, bubbles form. This is, we said, a chemical property. One of the things about chemical properties, they are always intensive. All chemical properties are intensive because you don't need chemicals. You don't need an amount of the chemical to do a reaction. You can do a little bit of reaction or you can do a lot of bit of reaction. How many bubbles form would depend on how much you have. But just the fact that bubbles form is going to be intensive. So all of my chemical properties that we had are going to be intensive. A liquid being bromine, names are intensive. Zinc conducts electricity. It doesn't matter how much you have, that's intensive. And in fact, our only extensive property here is the fact that a sample of seawater is 3.4 gallons. That word right there, a sample of seawater, is what we want to key in on. That inherently implies that there is a particular bit of seawater that we're looking at, and it's going to have a particular volume. So that's going to be an extensive property. It describes this bit of seawater.